My sister demanded I look after her 4 children on New Year's Eve while they enjoyed the vacation I was funding. My parents took her side, so I scrapped all the travel arrangements and watched them go ballistic. The locks were changed, my bags were on the curb, and my own mother wouldn't even look me in the eye. That's what it felt like, metaphorically, the day I finally said no. The quiet life I'd meticulously built for myself, a sanctuary of hard-won independence, had always felt precarious, perched on the edge of a family dynamic that saw me not as a person but as a resource. For years, I'd been the reliable one, the pragmatic one, the quiet sister who preferred the solitude of a good book to the cacophony of family gatherings. My name is Sarah, I'm 32, and my career as a senior financial analyst at a corporate firm in Minneapolis was proof that my quiet determination paid off. I owned my modest condo, drove a car that started every morning, and had the kind of savings account my younger self would have marveled at. It was a life carved out of diligence, far removed from the dazzling, attention-grabbing chaos that always seemed to orbit my older sister, Danielle. Danielle, 36, was the family's golden child. Even now, the phrase tastes bitter on my tongue. She married her high school sweetheart, Marcus Reed, at 23, and together they'd produced 4 beautiful, boisterous children: Ethan, 12, Olivia, 10, and the 7-year-old twins, Jackson and Harper. Growing up, Danielle was the sun around which our family revolved, popular, beautiful, her achievements celebrated with a blinding intensity that always left me in her shadow. My own good grades, my quiet successes, were just footnotes in the grand narrative of her life. Our mother, Connie, never bothered to hide her favoritism, and our father, Harold, well, he simply drifted along, a silent enabler, always choosing the path of least resistance. This deeply ingrained dynamic, this relentless comparison, had shaped every significant moment of my adult life, and it's a wound I've spent years in therapy trying to heal. About 5 years ago, the tradition of me funding elaborate family vacations began. Danielle and Marcus were in a financial pinch. Marcus, a sales rep for medical equipment, had an income as volatile as a stock market crash, while Danielle's part-time receptionist job barely covered insurance. Their finances took a nosedive, and I, ever the dutiful sister, offered to pay for a trip to Disney World for the kids. I told myself it was a one-time act of love, a gesture of support. But if I thought those early gestures were just about making memories, I was tragically mistaken. It became an expectation, an unwritten rule. Every year, increasingly elaborate trips, a cruise to the Bahamas, a ski trip to Colorado, a cross-country road trip through California that blew nearly $9,000 in from my savings. Each time, Danielle accepted my generosity with a barely audible thank you, while my parents would gush about what a wonderful mother she was, their praise for me conspicuously absent. This repeated pattern of being the anonymous benefactor, the invisible hand, is a classic example of how parental favoritism can continue to impact adult sibling relationships. The favored child often develops a sense of entitlement, expecting continued preferential treatment, while the unfavored child can internalize a belief that they must constantly strive to earn love and validation through acts of sacrifice or generosity. This year, however, I had planned something genuinely special. My parents were approaching their 40th wedding anniversary, a milestone that stirred something deeply sentimental within me. I spent months researching, finally settling on a stunning resort in Sedona, Arizona, renowned for its crimson red rock formations and luxurious spa. I booked 2 connecting suites, enough space for everyone, and paid the staggering $12,000 upfront, a requirement for holiday bookings. What no one in my family seemed to grasp was the sheer invisible labor involved. They saw the glossy itineraries, the confirmed reservations, but they never saw the hours I spent comparing prices, reading reviews, coordinating schedules, or handling every single logistical detail. For the Colorado ski trip alone, I'd spent 3 weeks finding ski schools for varying ages, calling the resort multiple times about equipment rentals for 4-year-olds, arranging transportation, booking kid-friendly restaurants, even buying bulk hand warmers. It was all simply expected. When things went smoothly, it was just the natural order of things. When something inevitably went wrong, like Ethan's food poisoning on the cruise, I bore the brunt of the blame, despite having zero control over kitchen hygiene. My best friend, Melanie, once asked me why I kept doing it. We were having lunch, and I was venting about the California road trip. I remember staring at my salad, the crisp lettuce wilting under my gaze, genuinely struggling to articulate an answer. The best I could offer was a mumbled confession that I wanted to feel like I belonged, like I was truly part of the family. Melanie's eyes, usually so bright, had clouded with such profound sadness that I quickly changed the subject. The Sedona trip felt different. It wasn't just guilt or obligation. My parents' anniversary genuinely mattered to me. I poured nearly 2 months into research, poring over travel blogs, watching YouTube walkthroughs of the resort, even joining an online forum for insider tips. This meticulous attention to detail felt like an act of love, not just a chore. I presented the trip at Thanksgiving. Everyone was gathered at my parents' house, and I'd put together a small presentation photos of the resort, the spa, hiking trails, the junior ranger programs for the kids. I watched, a knot of hope tightening in my stomach, as my mother's face lit up at the description of the anniversary dinner I'd arranged. My father actually teared up a little, a rare display of emotion that meant more to me than words could express. The kids buzzed with excitement about the pool. Even Marcus seemed genuinely pleased. Danielle's reaction was more subdued, but I chalked it up to holiday stress. She thanked me briefly, then pivoted the conversation to Ethan's basketball game. I told myself not to read into it, not to let my old insecurities sabotage what should have been a happy moment. What I didn't know then, couldn't possibly have known, was that the seeds of the real disaster had already been sown. The first hint of trouble came about 2 weeks before our departure, though looking back, there were smaller, almost imperceptible tremors I'd ignored. Days after Thanksgiving, Danielle posted on social media about needing a break from mommy duties, and her friends swarmed with sympathetic comments. I scrolled past it, dismissing it as typical online venting. Then Marcus made an offhand comment in a family group chat about how nice it would be to have adult time during the trip. I'd responded with a smiley emoji, picturing quiet evening dinners after the kids were asleep. The first real crack appeared when my mother, in an unrelated phone call, casually mentioned that Danielle had been researching high-end restaurants in Sedona. She dropped it like it was completely innocuous. When I asked why, since I'd already arranged all our dining, my mother laughed, saying Danielle just wanted options. I should have pressed harder. My stomach clenched with a vague unease, but I did what I always did with my family. I assumed the best and hoped any potential conflict would simply dissipate. Danielle called me on a Tuesday evening as I was finishing work reports. Her voice had that particular cadence I come to recognize over the years, a honeyed tone that signaled she wanted something and expected me to provide it. She explained that she and Marcus had been talking. They felt the trip would be the perfect opportunity for some alone time. They wanted to ring in the new year as a couple, just the two of them, free from the chaos of 4 children. They'd found a fancy restaurant in Sedona with a special New Year's Eve tasting menu, and they wanted a real date night. I said it sounded lovely and asked what their plan was for the kids. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She wanted me to babysit all 4 children on New Year's Eve. Not just for a few hours, but for the entire evening and night. They wanted to get a separate hotel room somewhere else for privacy, meaning I'd be responsible for the kids from late afternoon until the following morning. My blood ran cold. The phone felt like it weighed a ton, heavy in my hand, threatening to drag me under. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process the audacity of her request. I was paying over $12,000 for this trip. I had planned my own special activities, including a sunset meditation session on New Year's Eve that I'd been looking forward to for months. The resort had a gorgeous outdoor space for a champagne toast at midnight. I pictured myself standing under the Arizona stars, filled with hope for the year ahead. Instead, my sister wanted me to spend New Year's Eve wrangling her 4 children while she and her husband enjoyed a romantic evening, entirely on my dime. I told her I needed to think about it. She immediately got defensive. Her voice sharpened, laced with accusation. She reminded me that I didn't have kids, that I couldn't possibly understand how exhausting parenting was, that she and Marcus desperately needed this time together. And then, delivered with a casual cruelty that still makes my stomach clench, She pointed out that I was single and didn't have any romantic plans anyway. So, what difference does it make how you spend New Year's Eve? That comment stung more than I cared to admit. I'd been single for 3 years, not because I was unlovable, but because I'd made a conscious choice to focus on myself and my healing after a difficult breakup. Danielle knew this. She'd used it against me before, these subtle jabs about my Humpty condo or solo vacations, always delivered with a pitying smile that made me want to scream. The unspoken assumption beneath her words was what truly hurt in Danielle's worldview. My life had less value because it didn't conform to her traditional ideals of marriage and motherhood. My career accomplishments, my friendships, my personal growth, none of it registered as meaningful. I existed primarily as a resource, to be utilized by those whose lives supposedly mattered more. This pattern of invalidating another person's experiences and emotions, especially when it serves to justify one's own demands, can often be a subtle form of emotional manipulation. It minimizes the other person's reality, creating self-doubt and making it harder for them to assert their boundaries. I thought about all the New Year's Eves I'd spent with my family, the midnight toasts where I stood slightly apart from the coupled-up relatives, the way my mother would squeeze Harold's hand and gaze at Danielle and Marcus with warmth, barely acknowledging my presence. The kids' bedtimes always seemed to interrupt whatever quiet plans I might have made. Year after year, I'd shown up, participated, and tried to find joy in their celebrations while my own desires faded into the background. For once, I had imagined something different. The sunset meditation, the champagne toast, they weren't just activities, they were symbolic acts of self-care, a small celebration of my own journey. Danielle wanted me to trade all of that for diapers, bedtime negotiations, and the particular brand of chaos 4 children under 13 could generate. I told her again that I needed time to consider her request and ended the call. The next morning, a text from my mother landed in my inbox, asking me to call her. When I did, she launched into a familiar lecture about family obligations and sisterly love. Danielle, I realized, had already spun her version of events, painting me as selfish and unhelpful. My mother reminded me that Danielle had 4 children while I had the luxury of only worrying about myself. She said that family sometimes meant sacrifice, and she hoped I would do the right thing. My chest tightened. I asked my mother if she would be willing to watch the kids, since she and my father would also be on the trip. She laughed, a brittle sound. She explained that she and Harold were planning to enjoy the resort's amenities themselves, that they'd earned this relaxation after 40 years of marriage. She said it wouldn't be fair to ask them to babysit when I was the one without responsibilities. I pointed out, my voice trembling with suppressed frustration, that I was the one paying for the entire trip. My mother went quiet for a moment, then accused me of being tacky and hurtful, saying she'd raised me better than that. She ended the call with a final chilling hope that I'd come to my senses. Before the trip, I spent the next several days feeling like I was losing my mind. Melanie, my best friend, listened to the entire saga, her jaw practically on the table. She pointed out something I hadn't quite articulated to myself. The request wasn't just about babysitting. It was about my family's fundamental view of my place in their hierarchy. To them, my time, my money, my emotional energy all existed to serve their needs. The idea that I might have my own desires for New Year's Eve hadn't even occurred to Danielle. She'd simply assumed I'd be available because I was always available. Melanie also helped me see the financial absurdity. I was paying over $12,000 for a family vacation, and my reward for that generosity was to spend the biggest night of the trip alone with 4 children, while everyone else celebrated. It was like buying someone an expensive car and then being told I had to walk everywhere while they drove it. And that's when Melanie, my rock, helped me see something I'd been unwilling to admit for years. I also spoke with my therapist, Dr. Okonkwo. She had heard countless stories about my family dynamics over our 2 years together. During our session, she asked me to imagine what I would tell a friend in the same situation. The answer came immediately, raw and unfiltered. I would tell her to stand up for herself and refuse to be treated like the help. Dr. Okonkwo introduced a concept that shifted my entire perspective: the cycle of overfunctioning. She explained that by constantly stepping in, smoothing things over, and meeting everyone's needs, I was inadvertently preventing them from developing their own coping mechanisms and problem-solving skills. My generosity, well intentioned as it was, had become a crutch that allowed them to remain dependent and entitled. This psychological dynamic underscores the critical importance of setting healthy boundaries. While it might feel counterintuitive, refusing to overfunction for others often forces them to step up, ultimately fostering greater independence and healthier interpersonal relationships. I journaled extensively during those days. I went for long runs through my neighborhood, the December cold biting my cheeks as I tried to outpace my racing thoughts. I did everything I could to process my emotions, to figure out my next move. A week before the trip, my father called me. This was unusual. Harold rarely got involved in family conflicts, preferring to remain neutral, which usually meant enabling Connie and Danielle. He started by telling me how much the trip meant to him and my mother, how touched they were. A surge of warmth, a foolish hope, flickered within me. Then he pivoted. He understood watching the kids wasn't ideal, he said, but he asked me to consider it a gift to the family. He framed it as me helping Danielle's marriage, as if their relationship was somehow my responsibility. He mentioned that Marcus and Danielle had been having tension lately, and a romantic evening might be exactly what they needed to reconnect. I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, why Danielle's marriage was more important than my enjoyment of a trip I was entirely funding. He sighed heavily, a sound of paternal disappointment, and told me I was being difficult. Money wasn't everything, he said. Family should always come first. He hoped I would remember what really mattered. I ended the call feeling hollow and exhausted. I spent the rest of the evening staring at my living room wall, running through endless scenarios. I imagined caving, spending New Year's Eve surrounded by children while everyone else celebrated. I imagined the resentment festering inside me for months. I imagined next year, and the year after, an endless cycle of my generosity being exploited. That night, sleep was a distant dream. I lay in bed, watching shadows dance across my ceiling, my mind replaying every family vacation I'd funded. The cruise where Danielle complained her cabin was too small, despite my significant upgrades. The ski trip where my mother criticized the breakfast buffet, assuming I was paying for something better. The California road trip where Marcus grumbled about the rental car's size, conveniently forgetting he hadn't contributed a single dollar. In all those years, no one had ever asked what I wanted to do. The itineraries always revolved around the children's interests or my parents' preferences. If I suggested an activity, a museum perhaps, I was met with sighs and complaints about how boring it would be. My desires were consistently outvoted, dismissed. I'd learned to simply stop voicing them. Lying there in the darkness, a stark, painful realization began to solidify. I wasn't a full participant in these vacations. I was a sponsor. My function was to provide the resources and logistics, while everyone else enjoyed the experience. Asking me to babysit on New Year's Eve wasn't an aberration, it was a logical extension of how I'd always been treated. But the true turning point, the moment the dam finally broke, came not from another confrontation, but from a single, unassuming text message. 3 days before the trip, Danielle sent me a long text message. She thanked me for agreeing to watch the kids and outlined her plans for the evening departure times, kids' bedtimes, even restaurants that delivered to the resort. I hadn't agreed to anything. I stared at that message for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. She had interpreted my silence as consent, or maybe she'd known all along that I would eventually cave because I always did. I was the reliable one, the accommodating one, the sister who bent over backward to keep the peace while everyone else took and took and took. Something shifted inside me in that moment. It was subtle at first, like a small crack in a dam. Then the pressure built and built until everything broke loose. I didn't respond to Danielle's text. Instead, my fingers, shaking slightly, navigated to my phone's contact list. I called the resort in Sedona. I explained that I needed to cancel my reservation. The woman on the phone, her voice polite but firm, informed me that because I was canceling within 72 hours of check-in, I would forfeit my entire payment. $12,000. Gone. I didn't hesitate. I confirmed the cancellation. After ending that call, I sat in my living room and cried, not from regret, but from a profound, overwhelming relief. For the first time in years, I had chosen myself. I had refused to participate in a system that treated my generosity as an obligation and my feelings as irrelevant. The physical sensation of relief surprised me with its intensity. My shoulders dropped from their habitual position near my ears. My jaw unclenched. The persistent headache that had plagued me for a week dissolved within minutes. My body had been holding tension I hadn't even recognized until it suddenly released. It was like shedding a skin, an old, constricting skin I hadn't even realized I was wearing. I walked through my condo, touching familiar objects as if seeing them for the first time. The framed photograph of me at my college graduation, standing alone because my parents had left early for one of Danielle's events. The ceramic vase I bought myself after my first promotion, a small celebration my family had never acknowledged. The bookshelf filled with novels Danielle had always dismissed as pretentious or boring. Every corner of my home represented choices I'd made for myself. And yet, I'd been willing to surrender my autonomy the moment my family demanded it. I thought about calling Melanie, but I wasn't ready to talk. The decision felt too raw, too significant to share before I'd fully processed it. Instead, I made a cup of tea and sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker in the early evening darkness. I composed a group text to my parents and Danielle. I kept it simple, factual. I have cancelled the Sedona trip and will not be providing any further explanation. I wish you all a happy new year and ask that you respect my decision. Then I turned off my phone. I left it off for 3 glorious days. During that time, I did things for myself I'd put off for years. I deep cleaned my condo, not because it was dirty, but because the physical act of clearing clutter felt profoundly therapeutic. I donated 3 bags of clothes, including items I'd kept only because Danielle had given them to me as regifted cast-offs. I cooked elaborate meals just for myself, a complex mushroom risotto, homemade pasta with a slow simmered bolognese, a chocolate souffle that collapsed slightly but tasted like heaven. I watched movies I loved without worrying about anyone else's preferences. I binged an entire limited series Danielle had once mocked as melodramatic. I took long baths with expensive bath bombs I'd been hoarding for special occasions that never seemed to arrive. I slept in as late as I wanted, waking without an alarm for the first time in months. The December cold, crisp and biting on my cheeks, was a welcome sting, a physical sensation that anchored me to the present moment. Melanie called on the second day, worried when I didn't respond. I finally answered and told her everything. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then she laughed, a full-bodied sound of pure delight, and told me she'd never been prouder. She offered to come over and celebrate, but I told her I needed the solitude. She understood. During those quiet days, a surprising wave of grief washed over me. I'd expected only relief, perhaps some anxiety about the consequences, but not this profound sadness. I mourned the family I'd always wanted, the unconditional love I'd yearned for and never quite received. I cried for the little girl who tried so hard to earn her parents' approval, and the young woman who thought generosity could purchase love. I grieved the relationship I might have had with Daniel if our mother hadn't pitted us against each other, if I hadn't always been cast as a supporting character in my sister's story. This grief felt cleansing, not destructive. It was the sadness of finally accepting reality after years of hoping things would change. My family would probably never give me what I needed. That recognition hurt, but it also freed me from the exhausting effort of trying to earn something that should have been given unconditionally. When I finally turned my phone back on, the digital silence shattered into a cacophony of accusation. I had 47 missed calls, 83 text messages, and countless voicemails. The notifications loaded slowly, a cascading wall of increasingly frantic and angry communications. Danielle's text started confused and quickly escalated to furious. She accused me of ruining her children's vacation, destroying her marriage, and being the most selfish person she'd ever known. She called me names I won't repeat. My mother's messages were variations on disappointment and guilt. She couldn't believe I would do this to the family. She was heartbroken that I'd chosen to hurt everyone over something as trivial as babysitting. She questioned where she'd gone wrong raising me and asked how I could be so cold. My father left one voicemail, his voice tired and resigned. He hoped I was proud of myself and said this would take a long time to heal from. Marcus texted me directly, which he had never done before. His message was surprisingly civil compared to the others. He acknowledged the situation had gotten out of hand and suggested we talk when emotions cooled down. I appreciated his tone, but didn't respond. I also received messages from relatives I rarely spoke to. Apparently, Danielle had broadcast her version of events to the extended family, painting me as a monster who had cruelly yanked away a promised vacation days before it was supposed to happen. My Aunt Patricia, who I've always found exhausting, sent a long message about forgiveness and family bonds. My cousin Derek sent a brief text, "Are you okay?" It was the only supportive communication I received from any relative. In the weeks that followed New Year's, the fallout continued. Danielle stopped speaking to me entirely. When I tried to reach out in mid-January for a calm conversation, she blocked my number, then blocked me on all social media platforms. I later learned through my mother that Danielle had told her children I was no longer part of their lives. Ethan, Olivia, Jackson, and Harper, whom I had loved and spoiled for years, were now cut off from their aunt because their mother couldn't handle not getting her way. My parents invited me to dinner in mid-January under the guise of wanting to reconcile. I agreed because despite everything, I still loved them and hoped for a genuine conversation. Instead, I walked into an ambush. My mother spent the first hour detailing how much the family had been hurt by my actions. She wanted me to apologize to Danielle, to offer to pay for a makeup trip, essentially to grovel for forgiveness. I asked my mother if anyone was planning to acknowledge that I had been taken advantage of for years. She dismissed the question as dramatic and said that family helped family without keeping score. She pointed out that someday I might need help and wouldn't I want Danielle there for me? I reminded her that Danielle had never once been there for me. When I went through my difficult breakup 3 years ago, Danielle hadn't called once. When I had a cancer scare 2 years ago that thankfully turned out to be nothing, Danielle hadn't even sent a text. My generosity had always flowed in one direction, and any suggestion otherwise was pure fantasy. My father tried to intervene, suggesting we all take a breath. My mother, tears streaming down her face, insisted I was rewriting history to make myself the victim. The dinner ended with me leaving before dessert, my appetite gone, my heart heavy. A month later, an email from Marcus arrived. He apologized for how things had escalated and admitted the New Year's Eve request had been unreasonable. He'd been trying to talk to Danielle about reaching out to me, he wrote, but she remained firmly entrenched in her anger. He hoped time would soften things, and, for what it's worth, he appreciated the trips I'd funded over the years, even if he'd never properly thanked me. I thanked Marcus for his email, but made it clear I wouldn't be funding any more family vacations. I told him my relationship with Danielle would need significant repair before I could consider rejoining family events. He responded that he understood, but even as the family tried to pull me back into their orbit, a new kind of peace was beginning to take root within me. Spring arrived, and with it, a kind of peace I hadn't expected. Without the constant pressure of family expectations, I found myself breathing easier. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. I joined a pottery class and discovered a talent for wheel throwing. Each stroke of the clay, each breath of crisp Minnesota air on the hiking trails, was a silent affirmation of my newfound self. I started hiking on weekends, exploring trails around Minnesota I'd never known existed. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected because I'd always been too busy managing family dynamics. Melanie threw me a small celebration in March, 6 months before my 33rd birthday, just to acknowledge the changes I'd made. We gathered at her apartment, eating homemade pasta, drinking good wine. Someone asked about my family, and for the first time, I could talk about the situation without feeling like I was going to cry or explode. Dr. Okonkwo told me that what I'd done took tremendous courage. She said people who grow up in dysfunctional families often struggle their entire lives to break free from harmful patterns. By canceling that trip, I had drawn a boundary that should have been drawn years ago. The financial loss was significant, but the emotional freedom I gained was invaluable. Summer brought unexpected contact from my nieces and nephews. Ethan somehow found my email address and sent me a message asking why I didn't come around anymore. My heart broke reading his words. He was 12, confused why his aunt had apparently abandoned him. I wrote back carefully, telling him I loved him and his siblings very much, but that adult disagreements sometimes meant people needed space. I told him none of this was his fault, and that I hoped we could see each other again someday. Danielle found out about the email and sent me a blistering message through a new number, accusing me of trying to turn her children against her, demanding I never contact them again. I didn't respond, but I saved every message, just in case. My parents made another attempt at reconciliation in August, this time through my Aunt Patricia, who called me claiming to be neutral. She suggested a family meeting where everyone could air their grievances and work toward healing. I asked who was organizing it, my mother. I asked if Danielle had agreed to participate. Patricia admitted she wasn't sure. I politely declined the invitation, suggesting any genuine reconciliation would need to start with an acknowledgement of how I'd been treated, not another session of me being lectured about family obligations. And as the next holiday season rolled around, I knew I had a choice to make, one that would truly define how far I'd come. As autumn arrived, I felt genuinely content. The sharp pain of losing my sister, the complicated grief of estrangement from my parents, had faded into something more manageable. I still loved my family. I still hoped that someday we might find our way back to each other. But I no longer felt responsible for making that happen at the expense of my own well-being. My third birthday came in September, and I celebrated by taking myself on a solo trip to Portland, Oregon. I'd always wanted to visit, and without family obligations eating into my vacation budget, I could finally afford to explore somewhere new. I wandered through bookstores and coffee shops, hiked in Forest Park, and ate incredible food. I rang in my birthday at a rooftop bar, watching the sunset, surrounded by strangers, but feeling more whole than I had in years. One night during that trip, I wrote a letter to my younger self. I told her she was worthy of love and respect. I told her that being helpful and generous were beautiful qualities, but not when they came at the cost of her own dignity. I told her that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, and that the people who truly loved her would respect those boundaries rather than rage against them. When I got home, I found a card in my mailbox. It was from Olivia, my 10-year-old niece. She'd drawn a picture of us together at Disney World, back when I'd first started funding the trips. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, she'd written that she missed me and hoped I would come back soon. I cried for an hour after reading that card. Then, I placed it in a special box where I keep meaningful mementos, holding on to the hope that someday, when those kids were older, they would understand. The holidays approached again, and I braced myself for whatever chaos might come. My mother reached out in early December, her tone softer than it had been all year. She said she missed me and wanted me to come to Christmas dinner. She promised Danielle would be civil and that no one would bring up the trip incident. I asked my mother if she had thought about why I cancelled the trip in the first place. There was a long pause before she answered. She admitted she'd been reflecting on things and could see how the situation might have seemed unfair from my perspective. It wasn't the full acknowledgement I needed, but it was more than I'd expected. I told her I would think about Christmas. In the end, I decided not to go, not because I was holding a grudge, but because I knew I wasn't ready. Walking into that house, facing Danielle's resentment and my parents' complicated feelings, would undo months of healing. Maybe next year, I told myself. Maybe by then we'd all have grown enough to try again. I spent Christmas with Melanie and her family instead. They welcomed me warmly, treated me like one of their own, and reminded me what healthy family dynamics could look like. Melanie's mother asked about my pottery, genuinely interested. Her father challenged me to a board game and laughed when I beat him. Her younger brother teased me about my hiking obsession and promised to join me on a trail in the spring. Their laughter, their easy conversations, their genuine interest in my life wrapped around me like a warm, forgotten blanket. This New Year's Eve, one full year after everything fell apart, I stood on my balcony at midnight and watched distant fireworks scatter across the Minneapolis skyline. I thought about the person I was 12 months ago, the woman who had always put others first and considered her own needs secondary. I thought about the 12,000 I'd lost, a significant amount that still made my jaw clench. I thought about my sister, my parents, and my nieces and nephews, all the complicated threads of love and disappointment that made up my family. Most of all, I thought about what I gained. I gained my self-respect. I gained clarity about my worth. I gained the understanding that generosity should come from joy, not obligation, and that people who truly appreciate you never make you feel guilty for having needs of your own. I gained a year of growth and healing that wouldn't have been possible if I'd spent another New Year's Eve babysitting while my sister enjoyed a romantic dinner on my dime. Daniel still hasn't spoken to me. My parents maintain an uneasy peace, reaching out occasionally, but never quite addressing the core issues. Marcus sends me updates about the kids every few months, brief notes about report cards and basketball games, letting me know they're okay without requiring a response. I don't know what the future holds for my family. I don't know if Danielle will ever soften enough to have a real conversation with me. I don't know if my parents will ever fully understand why I did what I did. I don't know if those kids will grow up believing their aunt abandoned them, or if they'll eventually learn the truth. What I do know is that I made the right choice. For years, I allowed myself to be used because I confused obligation with love and generosity with self-worth. I thought that if I gave enough, helped enough, sacrificed enough, I would finally earn the love and respect I craved from my family. Instead, I just taught them that my boundaries didn't matter and my feelings were negotiable. Canceling that trip was the most expensive thing I've ever done. It was also the most valuable. If you're hearing this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're the family member who always gives while everyone else takes, if you've been guilted into believing that your needs matter less than everyone else's, I want you to know something important. You deserve better. You deserve to be appreciated, not exploited. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect, not one-sided obligation. Setting boundaries might cost you money. It might cost you relationships. It might cost you the illusion of family harmony that you've been desperately maintaining for years. But what you'll gain in return is something no amount of money can buy. You'll gain yourself. And that, I promise you, is worth everything. So, I ask you in your own life, where are you still paying an emotional, or even financial, price to maintain an illusion of harmony? What's the cost you're willing to pay for your own peace? And when is it finally time to collect that debt from yourself? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt caught in a similar dynamic where your generosity is exploited or your boundaries are dismissed, understand that you're not alone. The patterns of parental favoritism, sibling rivalry, and the psychological trap of overfunctioning are deeply ingrained in many families, often leading to cycles of resentment and burnout. Learning to identify these dynamics and then courageously setting healthy boundaries is a crucial step towards reclaiming your self-worth and building authentic relationships. It can be incredibly painful, feeling like you're sacrificing family ties, but the emotional freedom and self-respect you gain are invaluable. If you're struggling to navigate complex family relationships, or find yourself repeatedly giving too much, consider seeking support from a therapist or counselor who specializes in family systems. They can provide tools and strategies to help you understand your role, communicate your needs effectively, and build a life where your well-being is prioritized. Your mental and emotional health are not negotiable. They are foundational to a fulfilling life.